Hello, my name is Stephen Gluckstern, and on behalf of South by Southwest and High Grade Hemp Seed, I'd like to welcome you to a fireside chat, actually an art side chat. I'm here from the Arnold Lieberman Gallery with my good friend and colleague, Brando Crespi. Brando, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So we have many things we'll talk about today, but tell me a little bit about sustainability, because I know that's an area that's been of paramount concern of yours over many years. A little bit about how you define it and how you got into that sector of the business.
Well, that's I'll try and keep this succinct because it's a long story. But I got into the developmental area of this world by starting a foundation in Brazil called Pro Natura. Originally, it was going to be WWF Brazil, but the government wouldn't allow us to open that. So we started our own, and our first project was very ambitious, which was to influence the deforestation and the extraordinary damage that migrant farmers were causing in the Amazon. And there are 7 areas which were mostly affected by the slash and burn approach. And we chose the worst, which was Juruena on the border of Mato Grosso. And at the time, the flavor of the month was conservation. So the idea was we protect an area and we will put fences or call it an oasis and make sure that what happens inside that fulfills some kind of ideal of protection and conservation. Well, this was 12.5 million hectares. So putting fences around something which was a little larger than the UK was a little ambitious or improbable. And the whole idea also of putting guards with guns to protect it was equally absurd. These are, migrants who are surviving. And so we had to find a different approach. And 35 years later, this is considered to be one of the best, if not the best, development projects, according to the World Bank in South America. What we did was essentially try to find a way to turn the people who were part of the problem into part of the solution. And that meant essentially a lot of cultural work, which was something that was close to my interest because I'd studied cultural anthropology and had spent time in the Amazon in the 70s. We're now 86. Spending time with some tribal people and especially with shamans and studying ethnobotany with them and so on. But, on this area, there were uncontacted tribes, there were small communities, mostly smallhold farmers who had 2.5 hectares and would burn and then grow for 2.5 years and move on. So we had to figure out a way to improve their livelihood in a way which would not damage the surrounding environment. And we understood that agriculture was really the key to a lot of that. And also the sustainable use of forest resources, although again, sustainability was not really a used word. Today, sustainability is a semantic wastebasket. You can throw anything you want in there, like natural in the 80s and 90s. It was the most polluted word in the English language. Yeah. And but at the time, we had to essentially teach farmers how to farm in ways which were again sustainable, but which essentially did not deplete the soil. And the soil in the Amazon is not very rich. We'll come back to that because it impacts the hemp industry, what we've learned in the Amazon. So eventually what we did is we started asking people to think long term. What would their lives be? What would their children's life be in 50 years? And what were the assets that they had? Because they had a long list of problems, understandably so, from health and education to actual food security, because you can hunt, but it's hard to grow things. So ultimately, we organized people in cooperatives, which was one of the best ways. And we looked at how to generate a convergence of interest and enthusiasm on long-term objectives. And that is still today a very useful and applicable strategy.
Well, it almost sounds like that was a cultural shift as well as anything else. It wasn't just about the agriculture or just about the soil. It was that getting people to think in a way that would allow them to be, so that our world is sort of, or their world is regenerative as opposed to exploitive or extractive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And those problems are still today's problems. We haven't changed much, but we did manage to bring in Forest Stewardship Council, FSC, and to certify the wood and certified how to extract wood in a sustainable manner. And then one of the big turning points was we got Peugeot, the French car company, to offset their emissions by creating the first large-scale carbon sink in the world. And we planted 2 million trees, which seems simple, but it actually isn't. And for a number of reasons, including the fact that we were blackmailed by one of the local bureaucrats who wanted to monopolize the search for seeds, which is a very important part of all of this, because today people think of forestry or reforestation, and very often what they don't realize is that it's a monoculture. Because it's the simplest, cheapest way to grow, and from an industrial point of view, that's what makes sense. From a life system point of view, it does not. So you need diversity. And today there are more species in these 2,000 hectares that we planted than there were when we replanted.
So Brando, you've done many things in your life, and in many different areas. Tell me, so when you were a teenager, what did you aspire to do? What interested you back then?
So what I really wanted to do was to explore, to go out, to see, to live, to experience. And I was very interested in the mysterious and in the prohibited. And my house in Rome had its own entrance to a catacomb. So my passion for archaeology, for instance, I think really started because when I was 10 or 11 years old, I figured out where they kept the key to the gate, which then allowed me to go in. And going in was so risky. I was told I was going to die if I went in there because it's a labyrinth. You can get lost. So I went in with a long thread. Then I brought rice and started dropping rice, so I knew how to get back. And so I guess I always really wanted to be an explorer in some ways.
And so, you know, Americans, we think of our world as being about 200 years old. That's all we go back maybe 250 because we celebrated that. Now, as I recall, your family has been in the textile business for a little bit, even longer than that.
Well, for 500 years or so, yeah. and in the cotton business. And my great-great-grandfather then went to Brazil and brought some of his own know-how and the family know-how to Brazil and became the largest cotton grower and producer and textile weaver in Brazil, which is why I have a Brazilian passport, apart from an Italian one. So yes, I was always connected to textiles because, well, my mother was an editor of American Vogue. My father launched most of the Italian designers. And there was a period in my life where let's say a more commercial period of my life, where I arrived in Los Angeles with a pregnant wife and quickly realized that there was nothing romantic about La Boheme, about being poor in Los Angeles, that I needed to kind of get my act together commercially. And so I went back into the luxury business, launched Rodeo Drive, and eventually represented all the top Italian luxury fashion companies in America.
I've heard of some of them. And I know there's a great story that you and I once shared about when Woody Harrelson was looking for a hemp-made suit. Can you tell that story a little bit?
Yeah, well, that's actually later, because in the mid-'80s, I was already started Pro Natura, and later co-founded other NGOs, one called Global Action Plan. And in the 90s, I decided that I really wanted to focus on things which were more meaningful to me than rags and expensive sheets and beautiful cashmere things. But so I went back to Europe, and I found myself that I understood green marketing and greenwashing very well, and that there were companies that were trying to evolve themselves to become greener, and that was incredibly difficult for them because their whole culture was not about that. The culture was extractive, was not collaborative, it was not, but I knew that I could leverage certain things to help companies become greener. Most of these big multinationals would find it easier to buy a smaller brand which had a green image and then destroy it by mismanaging it. An exception is Ben & Jerry and Unilever. They've done a good job there. Anyway, what happened in the beginning of the years 2000 is that I was in Holland at a social venture network conference and met a bunch of Americans who had moved to Holland and who were very interested in the genetics of the cannabis plant, and also owned equity in a Chinese hemp fabric company. So based on what I now knew cotton was, which was a very unecological plant, primarily because farmers in developing countries tend to use pesticides as if they were, one of God's gifts.
Yes.
And so I got to see the impact it had on their children, which were often born with terrible problems. And at the time, this was somewhat ironic because my family was in the cotton business for so long, but not necessarily. Cotton was organic for centuries. It's only in the last 60, 70 years that we started using chemical inputs. Anyway, I knew that hemp did not need any of these inputs, but I also knew that hemp generally was a very rough fabric. The texture of hemp was unfriendly. So good for sails, good for ropes, but not really good for clothing. But my new friends in Holland showed me some of the fabrics that were coming out of China. And I said, I can do something with this. So I went to Armani and I said, you should get green. And let's, look at this. These are amazing fabrics, and they don't use a lot of water. They don't use pesticides. They generally don't use herbicides. And he loved it, much to my surprise. He actually loved it so much that he decided to cover all the walls of his new offices in Milan with our fabrics. And then we created an eco jeans line. And Woody Harrelson heard about this. So he, on his own, took his plane or rented a plane, came to Milan, and went to Armani and congratulated him. He said, I really want to congratulate you. You've done something fantastic. And Armani was very pleased by this. So he made him 2 dinner jackets, one in white and one in black, with our fabrics. And which he then, used during the Oscars and one other big event. And so that was really interesting. Then I went to a few other designers and got them involved.
And why hasn't, or has it, has the hemp fabric not become more pervasive in fashion today?
It's a good question. I think that a lot of it has to do with with issues around the quality of the fabric. So it's much, it makes more sense to blend it with other with other materials, with other, and actually we were experimenting with this at Armani and getting our Chinese friends to manufacture different blends. And one of them, I won't say what, Armani said, these are the most beautiful jeans I've ever seen in my life. So I still think one day we should go back to that, and maybe do it in Santa Fe Farm.
That would be very interesting.
Yeah.
So I want to shift a little bit, and one of the things that we're all talking about in the hemp industry and sort of on the edges of sustainability is biochar. That biochar has come back into, it's been around for a long time, and I know it's something that you have a particular passion about. Tell us a little bit about why you're passionate about it and sort of what you think the future of biochar might be here over the next 10 or 20 years.
Well, indeed, biochar has been around a long time, maybe 8,000 years, and in the Amazon, it allowed for the creation of these, for the existence of these incredible garden cities that Francisco de Orellana saw in 1542 when he came down the Amazon River, and he described these cities, which today we know were larger than London at the time. But archaeologists didn't believe that the soil could support that kind of population density until they discovered something called black earth of the Indian, terra preta dos Indios. And this is a soil which is 900% more fertile than the soil around it. And it was terraformed over thousands of years by Amerindians who realized that by adding ground charcoal to the ground, that this brought about a number of effects. Well, today there are 20,000 studies on the effects, and the Chinese have embraced this. We are behind the curve. And we know that we can increase yields from maybe 50 to 200%, in some cases more, of a number of plants and of a number of trees, including hemp, obviously. What makes biochar so interesting is not only this impact, that is on the fertility of the soil, but the fact that biochar is essentially carbon. And when you put it in the soil, it stays in the soil. You cannot take it out. That means that it is probably one of the best tools we have to decarbonize our atmosphere. Well, better yet, photosynthesis does that. Plants use CO2 to grow, and hemp are extraordinary to do that.
Right.
You know, an acre of hemp can be, depending on where you are, closer or farther away from the equator, can be the equivalent of 10 acres of forest. And forests take 10 to 20 years to start really absorbing carbon. So hemp not only absorbs carbon when you grow it, the problem is that most of the time we are disposing of it by burning it. And so we're putting that back in the atmosphere. But if we turned it into biochar and put it back into the ground, first of all, we have an elegant circular model where nothing is wasted. But the next thing that happens is that the soil starts improving, the mycorrhiza, there's a number of effects. The soil becomes much more life-giving, if you want. And that will improve the quantity of active metabolites, THC, CBD in the plant. It will speed up the growth and so on. But equally important, it will actually allow us at Santa Fe Farms to become a really active participant in what is the greatest challenge of our time, which is how to minimize our climate crisis.
Interesting. And are there people that argue against the use of biochar, or is this one of those ideas that really there's no downside, we just haven't yet gotten our society to accept it the way it needs to be accepted?
There was one gentleman, an Englishman, who fought against biochar. And his fear, he had come out of a very successful, and I approve very much of his efforts against biofuels. So when the whole biofuel battle was, at least from an intellectual point of view, won, meaning this is not a good idea. We shouldn't be using land to, fly planes or grow food stuffs to do that. He moved to biochar, and his concern was that one day we would grow a whole forest and turn them into biochar. And Nature magazine came out about 10 years ago with a study that basically said there's enough waste, and I really don't like that word, but waste biomass in the world to turn into biochar and offset about 12% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's enormous.
Yes.
And that is a very conservative estimate because we don't really want to get into data and numbers and so on here, but the problem is that you have an incredible disparity in the number of results that you get from biochar. It depends on how bad the soil was at the beginning. It's not so much, a ton of biochar equals more or less 2.7 tons of CO2.
Yeah.
Everybody more or less agrees with that. That's a baseline. We can all agree. And carbon traders accept that. But there are scientists who say the real figure is 10 times higher.
Yeah.
So what is important to me is not so much to attach oneself to data and say this is the right data. But what is important to me is a more pragmatic point of view. What is the data the carbon traders will accept?
I think there's a whole future, this whole notion of sequestration and commoditization that we'll see over the next 10 or 15 years as it becomes, certainly in the hemp business, becomes more prevalent in that way.
Yeah.
Tell me about the Mitchell Prize a little bit, and I think you've got to tell me about it twice actually, but I'll take one to start.
Well, the Mitchell Prize was a prize given every 4 years by the U.S. Academy of Sciences, and is considered to be the Nobel of Sustainability. And we got it because of our work, primarily because of Pro Natura's work in Juruena in the Amazon. It really, I think, recognizes an approach which is very community-based, which really tries to energize communities around a common goal, long-term goal, and which starts looking at assets instead of needs and how to maximize those assets. Today, for instance, the World Bank has integrated our model, which we call the, what do we call it? The shared value platform. So the shared value platform is a model which brings capital, 20% impact capital, 20% as philanthropy, and 80% as an investment. What that does is the 20% actually de-risks the 80%. So we're starting this approach, which is an evolution of Pro Natura's original methodology, is now being used by the World Bank and the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, and us in about 7 or 8 African countries. So we have a model, we create local foundations where we bring everybody in. Then under the local foundation or in parallel to the local foundation, we create interest groups. So fishermen, for instance, we would put fishermen from different villages working together. I don't want to go too much into all of this, but the bottom line is that the Mitchell Prize recognized that the traditional model of conservation was not workable. Right. And that we needed to move into something which was much more long-term and which integrated all the various needs of a community, not from a point of view of a PhD from an American university coming and saying, what you need is this, but from their point of view, so that they would own their future and they would own the means to get to their future.
It's very interesting because, as you know, at Santa Fe Farms, we're very interested in understanding indigenous people and what's going on. And obviously, we're North American based, so we're starting here. And through one of our other partners, through Roger Frawa, who I know you've met, talking a lot about what it is that we can do and how can we use this magical hemp plant as maybe the tip of a wedge, right? To say, are there things that we can do, whether it be regenerative agriculture or this larger scale, the systems that are being faced by people who have a lot of disadvantages in terms of what they have to face every day. I know that that we're deeply committed to developing building materials that can be literally grown on the reservations, can be manufactured there, providing all kinds of other opportunities, and then ultimately providing housing and allowing that housing to be sustainable from that area. So I'm very much attuned to that, and I think that the industry, the hemp industry, as it begins to think, is generally thinking in these kinds of ways, that it's not an exploitive industry. Many other businesses got started and thought about themselves as, what can we take out of the earth and how much money can we make? And I think that the more the people that I've met in our new business have been anxious to try to figure out how would you develop a business that in fact was sustainable and that was not exploitive. We talked a little bit earlier, but maybe touch on it again. What does the word sustainable mean to you? And how does that then, in your mind, get applied to the kinds of things we're doing at Santa Fe Farms or to the hemp industry generally?
Sustainable really started off, I think, with an economics framework. In other words, people were looking at how do we increase the income of people and manage to do that for a long term, and hopefully keep on increasing the well-being and economic well-being of people. To me, that is a very passé, very old definition of sustainability. Today, sustainability is deeply connected to climate issues because we realize that whatever business you can create, which is built upon the progressive, inclusive values, if you are in the midst of a drought and have no water, or if you're in a flood, or if nature is all of a sudden going wild on you, there's no way that that business will survive. And that's what we are discovering, and we have been discovering for the last 30 years, working with farmers around the world, is that they knew that things were changing. And very often they were coming down from the mountains, look at the Kogi Indians in Colombia, and saying, wake up, what's going on? You're messing with life systems. And these are essential to our collective future. So what sustainability means today to me is it's not only being responsible about your supply chain, which is what most people look at. It's obviously you need to do that. You need to be responsible to the supply chain and to the human element of your whole business, stakeholders, and way beyond that. But when you realize that you can bring the best technology in the world, you can teach people to fish in a more efficient way, give them a hook instead of a fish, to use the old metaphor, that's not enough. That's really not enough. And one perfect example is that one day, about 10 years ago, I was called by Nespresso, who said, have you seen the latest study by Q, an English research and incredible gardens, about coffee growing in Ethiopia? And I had seen that, and basically that study said that by 2050, Ethiopia would lose, best case scenario, 98% of its coffee production because of climate change. And coffee needs altitude. Well, you can go up and up and up, but there's a limit to how up you can go. So I ended up spending an amazing time in Ethiopia, in the mountains of Ethiopia, working with coffee farmers, but they have the same problems that African or Asian farmers have, and different from American farmers, although climate is always here. We also have to deal with the impact of an industrial, exploitative, extractive mindset especially on the soil. And American soil is incredibly damaged to the point that in 60 years, we may have lost our topsoil.
So that's interesting. We could link that back to the discussion on biochar and whether or not biochar and that it can, obviously, if it's employed correctly, have a regenerative effect for us here. So, Brando, let's switch topics a little bit. So you and I are the same age. And my children often ask me about legacy, right? And so I'm interested in what you think about your legacy, what you'd like to be known for, or if anything, or as you think about sort of the last third of your life, we'll call it, what you'd like to accomplish and be remembered for.
My son asked me that question, and on one hand, I can throw data at myself. Like, we've gotten 6.5 million people in 62 countries out of poverty. Meaningless, really. Well, not, but, doesn't really, it's nice. Let's put it that way. I'm really not interested in my legacy. I don't even know really what that means. I do hope that my children and friends will remember me with a smile.
Mm-hmm.
That's my legacy. If there's anything.
We're very similar. I can see it. It's sort of the answer. I think that in any that for most human beings, what you want to be remembered for is that you left the world in a better place than when you arrived, and you had some little piece of that. And some people have very powerful positions that can do it in large scale, but all of us have the ability in terms of how we treat people and how we think about our businesses to say that when you're there looking back, which is, hey, you know what, the world, I did everything I could to try to make the world a little bit better. And I think that obviously you have a remarkable story, and the things that you've accomplished I'm convinced that's going to be true for sure. And as we think about, to me, now we think about this new industry, as we embark on this hemp story here, that there is a lot of opportunity to make the world a better place. And I think all our stakeholders can benefit, from investors to indigenous people to the farmers to our soil. I mean, I like you, am very concerned about what the world looks like 100 years from now, and what, not just politically what it looks like, but can we sustain the people on the earth? Can we provide the foods that we need and all that? So
climate smart agroecology applied on a global scale can feed 3 times the amount of people we have today easily. So the problems start happening locally when you start looking at the desertification. Then you have, like in the Sahel, the areas around the Sahara. But desertification is southern Italy, it's Spain, it's Greece. I'm thinking of my neck of the woods. It's Santa Fe, where we have big problems with water. And I just read that they are asking farmers not to plant this year, which is quite extraordinary. The whole of New Mexico agriculture is already dramatically impacted by this. Now, what comforts me is the fact that we have been working on this for about 20-some years, and we have projects in 13 countries around the Sahara Desert, and we have proven repeatedly that the use of biochar, maybe some camel dung or bison dung here, or compost certainly, and a lot of elbow grease, and why not some laughter and communal good feelings and energy, can take sterile sand, the Sahara, and turn that into 11 harvests a year. And we can do that using about 15% of the water that normally one would use, although normally there's no such thing as turning the Sahara into a vegetable garden. So if we can do it there, we can do it here. And those techniques, I mean, there's an extraordinary amount of creativity worldwide looking at environmentally sound approaches to agriculture. And it's incredibly important for our food security, but also because agriculture is a very powerful element in the whole climate issue.
It's very interesting because, as you know, I've spent some time on Wall Street many years ago. And I think that for most people, and most people who don't grow up on farms, you don't think very much about it, right? You think you go to the grocery store and that's where you get, where does food come from? It comes from the grocery store. And I think that as I've now had a chance to spend, the last number of years sort of focused on where, in fact, does food come from and what is it that we grow, that you see that, and there's now even on Wall Street, this sort of ag tech movement, right? Where people saying, well, technology, and by the way, technology can help us a lot in agriculture. The data and how the data is collected, that's one of the things, as you know, at Santa Fe Farms, we're going to spend a significant amount of investment making sure we collect that data to understand and, find ways to turn that Saharan sand into fertile agricultural soil. So Brando, that was a very interesting conversation about sustainability and what it means to you. Do you think that that hemp can play a role in a sustainable future for the earth?
I am absolutely convinced about that. I think hemp is an extraordinary raw material which will fuel the future of so many different industries. But I don't think that our future on this planet is determined on one particular technology or plant or anything like that. I mean, we need to move from a culture which is based on Darwinian and Malthusian values. It's not enough for everybody and only the big fish eats, to a culture which is collaborative and regenerative. And until we do that, basically we have all the solutions today that we need. You know, that's a paradox. We do not need to be in the mess we're in. And in a way, COVID has demonstrated this by the fact that by slowing down our extractive system, economic system, nature has reemerged triumphant. And hemp is a kind of metaphor about a sustainable future because it has so many different uses. From, you know, Henry Ford's car, which is a perfect example, nothing new under the sun, right? To whatever we will do with advanced materials based on hemp fibers. I think it's important, however, that the hemp industry realizes that it has a role and an important role to play in our climate crisis. And until it does that, it will always be sitting on a stool lacking one of the, you know, supports.
One of the legs.
One of the legs, yeah.
You know, it's a wonderful answer. By the way, I completely agree with you. One of the things that I think we've been through a period over the last 40 or 50 years in which, as a society, people focused more on their piece of the pie than growing the pie. And I think that we're coming to a recognition that and there have been other times in our history that growing the pie helps us all.
Yeah.
And that it's not really about your share, it's about what we can do to restore, you know, equity in a way, and whether that's be for the indigenous people or whether that be economics or whether that be healthcare, all of those things are part of that. So I share your optimism, and I share your view that hemp it's not the be all and end all. It's not the only thing that needs to happen, but it has a very important role to play as we rethink about how we deal with the planet we live on.
Absolutely. And it's going to be exciting to use hemp in a way, as a Trojan horse to demonstrate that we can do things differently, that we can do things in harmony with nature, and that even our own business, Santa Fe Farm, can be an expression of values which are grounded in biophilia, in the love for life. And the love for each other's life, love for a collective life, and for life in the greatest sense, because we do not exist outside of this extraordinary, miraculous system, which includes every single bacteria to the most beautiful birds in the rainforest.
Great. Thank you, Brando, and thank you in the audience for joining us for a fascinating discussion. And thank you for taking the time today.
Oh, thank you.
Wonderful conversation. I look forward to
My
many
pleasure.
more. Thank you. That was awesome.
Good.
Awesome.
Happy.